Bullies vandalized new kid's bike. Bad choice. He was a judo black belt. The morning mist clung to the asphalt of the Lincoln High School parking lot like ghostly fingers reluctant to release their grip on the night. Kieran Blackwood adjusted the frayed shoulder strap of his worn canvas backpack for the third time in as many minutes, a nervous habit he'd developed since arriving in this unfamiliar California town 3 weeks ago. The weight of the bag, heavy with second-hand textbooks and carefully organized notes, seemed to grow heavier with each passing day, as if it were absorbing not just his academic materials, but all the uncertainty and anxiety that had become his constant companions. His slight frame, 5 feet 6 inches of lean muscle hidden beneath clothes that had seen better days, moved with a careful precision that spoke of someone who had learned to navigate the world by making himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Dark hair, the color of rich coffee, fell across his forehead in an unruly wave that he habitually pushed aside, a gesture that revealed intelligent brown eyes that held depths of experience far beyond his 17 years. Those eyes, his mother often said, were a gift from his grandfather, eyes that saw not just what was, but what could be. The thrift store clothes he wore told a story he wished he didn't have to share. The jeans, purchased for $3 at a Goodwill in Portland, had been expertly mended by his mother's skilled hands, where a previous owner had worn them thin. His flannel shirt, soft from countless washings, hung loose on his frame, chosen more for warmth and durability than style. Even his sneakers, once white but now a careful shade of off-white, maintained through diligent cleaning, spoke of a family that counted every dollar and made every purchase with careful consideration. Moving from Portland to this particular corner of California had been necessity, not choice. His father, James Blackwood, had worked for the same manufacturing company for 15 years before budget cuts and corporate restructuring had eliminated his position, along with those of 47 other employees. The severance package had lasted exactly 3 months, during which James had sent out hundreds of resumes and attended dozens of interviews, each rejection chipping away at the quiet confidence that had once defined him. The opportunity in California had come through a former colleague, a position paying less than his previous job, but offering the hope of stability. The family had packed their belongings into a rented truck, leaving behind not just a house, but a community, friends, and the dojo where Kieran had spent nearly every afternoon for the past 10 years, training under his grandfather's patient guidance. Lincoln High School rose before him like a monument to California affluence, its modern architecture and perfectly manicured landscaping a stark contrast to the modest public school he'd attended in Portland. Here, the parking lot showcased a parade of vehicles that cost more than his family's annual rent. BMW sedans, lifted pickup trucks, and sleek sports cars that gleamed under the morning sun like expensive jewelry. The students who emerged from these vehicles moved with the unconscious confidence that came from never having to worry about money, their designer clothes and easy laughter creating an invisible barrier that Kieran had yet to find a way through. The social hierarchies at Lincoln High weren't just established. They were carved in stone tablets that had been passed down through generations of wealthy families whose children attended this school as a birthright rather than a privilege. Newcomers, particularly those who arrived without the proper credentials of wealth and family connections, either found their place quickly in the complex ecosystem or became targets for those who fed on the insecurity and displacement that marked them as different. Kieran had hoped that his strategy of blending into the background would allow him to navigate these treacherous social waters unnoticed until he could find his footing. He'd perfected the art of invisibility over the years, sitting in the middle sections of classrooms where teachers' eyes rarely lingered, choosing lunch tables on the periphery of the cafeteria where conversations hummed around him without requiring his participation, walking through hallways with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged while carefully avoiding eye contact that might invite unwanted attention. But invisibility, he was learning, was a luxury that required a certain level of conformity to achieve. His second-hand clothes, his obvious lack of the material possessions that served as social currency among his peers, and his careful, measured way of speaking marked him as an outsider, as clearly as if he'd worn a sign announcing his difference. The morning sun, climbing higher in the cloudless October sky, cast long shadows across the parking lot as Kieran approached the area near the gymnasium where students were allowed to lock their bicycles. The bike racks, constructed of heavy-duty steel and painted in the school colors of blue and gold, stood like sentinels guarding a collection of expensive mountain bikes and sleek road bikes that represented recreational cycling rather than transportation born of necessity. His own bicycle looked like a refugee among these pristine machines. The second-hand mountain bike, purchased from a garage sale for $40, bore the scars of its previous owner's adventures, scratches in the paint that told stories of trails conquered and obstacles overcome, components that had been replaced over the years with whatever parts were available rather than what matched the original specifications. The frame, once a vibrant red but now faded to a dusty burgundy, still held together solidly despite its battle-worn appearance. The derailleur, replaced with a model that was close but not quite right, required a delicate touch to shift smoothly. The handlebars, wrapped in black tape that showed white where his hands gripped most frequently, had been adjusted to accommodate his height and riding style. It wasn't much to look at, especially surrounded by bikes that cost more than some people's monthly salary, but it was reliable transportation and, more importantly, one of the few connections he maintained to his life in Portland. His grandfather had taught him basic bicycle maintenance in the garage behind the dojo, patient hands guiding Kieran's smaller ones as they learned to true wheels, adjust brakes, and maintain the mechanical precision that kept the bicycle functioning smoothly. Every turn of a wrench, every adjustment of a cable, carried with it the memory of those quiet afternoons when the only sounds were the gentle click of tools and his grandfather's soft-spoken instructions about patience, precision, and taking pride in work well done. As Kieran straightened up from securing his bike with the heavy chain lock his mother had insisted upon, one of their few concessions to the reality that not everyone shared their family's respect for other people's property, the sound of mocking laughter reached his ears like fingernails on a chalkboard. The laughter had a particular quality to it, the kind of sound that spoke of cruelty disguised as humor, of entertainment found in another person's discomfort. Well, well, looks like Charity Case is here early today. The voice belonged to Tanner Mills, and even without turning around, Kieran could picture the expression that accompanied those words, the slight smile that never reached his eyes, the way his head tilted just enough to suggest he was looking down on whoever had earned his attention, regardless of their relative heights. Tanner Mills was Lincoln High School's unofficial king of making other people's lives miserable, a title he'd earned through a combination of natural charisma, inherited wealth, and a talent for identifying and exploiting weakness in others. At 6 feet tall, with the kind of athletic build that came from good genetics, expensive personal trainers, and participation in sports that demanded both strength and conditioning, he moved through the school like he owned it, which, given his father's position on the school board and the family's generous donations to various school programs, wasn't far from the truth. His blonde hair, cut and styled by professionals who charged more for a single appointment than Kieran's family spent on groceries in a week, caught the morning light like spun gold. His clothes, designer jeans that fit perfectly, a polo shirt that probably cost more than Kieran's entire wardrobe, and shoes that looked like they'd never touched anything more challenging than polished marble, advertised his family's wealth with the subtlety of a billboard. Everything about Tanner Mills screamed entitlement, from his perfectly straight teeth, courtesy of years of expensive orthodontic work, to his easy confidence that came from never having been told no about anything that really mattered to him. But it was his eyes that revealed the true nature of his character. Blue as a summer sky, but cold as winter ice, they held a calculating intelligence that had learned to find entertainment in other people's pain. Tanner had discovered early in life that his combination of looks, wealth, and athletic ability gave him power over his peers, and he'd spent years honing his skills at wielding that power with surgical precision. Flanking Tanner were his constant companions, Jackson Reed and Braden Foster, both of whom had long ago surrendered their individual identities in exchange for the reflected glory that came from association with Lincoln High's golden boy. They followed him like loyal dogs, eager to laugh at whatever cruelty their leader dished out, ready to escalate any situation that might require their particular brand of aggressive stupidity. Jackson Reed was the muscle of the group, stockier than Tanner, with the kind of build that came from hours in the weight room, and a metabolism that processed protein shakes and supplements into visible bulk. His crew cut, maintained with military precision, and his permanent sneer gave him the appearance of someone perpetually ready for a fight. Where Tanner's cruelty was calculated and precise, Jackson's was blunt and physical. He was the hammer to Tanner's scalpel, useful for situations that required intimidation through the implied threat of violence. Braden Foster represented a different type of enabler entirely. Taller than both Tanner and Jackson, but carrying his height awkwardly, like he'd grown too fast for his coordination to keep up, he channeled his nervous energy into whatever direction Tanner pointed him. His sharp features and darting eyes gave him the appearance of someone constantly looking for an angle, a weakness to exploit, a joke to make at someone else's expense. Where Jackson provided muscle and Tanner provided leadership, Braden served as the group's social media manager, the one who ensured that every humiliation was documented and shared, every moment of cruelty preserved for posterity and maximum embarrassment. Together, the three of them had perfected a system of social terrorism that kept the student body of Lincoln High School in a constant state of low-level anxiety. They were careful to avoid targets who might fight back effectively. The children of other wealthy families, the star athletes who had their own social protection, the academic superstars whose parents had connections that could cause problems. Instead, they focused their attention on those who couldn't or wouldn't fight back. The shy kids, the poor kids, the ones who were different in ways that made them vulnerable. Kieran kept his head down, hoping desperately to avoid the confrontation that seemed to be building like storm clouds on the horizon. He'd learned through bitter experience over the past 3 weeks that responding to Tanner's provocations only made things worse, providing more ammunition for the ongoing campaign of harassment that had become a daily feature of his school experience. His mother, Sarah Blackwood, was already under enough stress trying to adapt to their new circumstances, working longer hours at a job that paid less than her previous position, while struggling to maintain the household and provide some semblance of stability for her family. The last thing she needed was her son getting into trouble at school, adding disciplinary meetings and parent-teacher conferences to her already overwhelming list of responsibilities. But Tanner Mills wasn't the type of person to let potential entertainment slip away simply because his target refused to engage. He'd learned that sometimes the most satisfying reactions came from people who tried desperately not to react at all, that there was a particular pleasure to be found in pushing someone until their carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Goodwill," Tanner called out, using the nickname he'd coined after observing Kieran's second-hand wardrobe for the first few days. The name had stuck among his followers and had begun to spread through certain circles of the student body, marking Kieran with a label that reduced his entire identity to his family's economic circumstances. "Where'd you get that sweet ride? The junkyard? Or did you find it abandoned behind a dumpster somewhere?" Students walking past began to slow their pace, sensing the brewing confrontation with the instinctive awareness that teenagers possessed for social drama. Some looked amused, their expressions holding the cruel entertainment that came from watching someone else's misfortune. Others appeared uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, caught between their better angels and their instinct for self-preservation. The unspoken rule at Lincoln High was clear: you didn't interfere with Tanner Mills unless you wanted to become his next target. Kieran paused in his walk toward the building, his hands clenching involuntarily before he forced them to relax, drawing on the breathing techniques his grandfather had taught him during their countless hours of training together. He could hear Grandpa Yuki's voice as clearly as if the old man was standing beside him. True strength is knowing when not to use it, Kieran. The strongest warrior is the one who wins without fighting. But remember, sometimes the greatest victory comes from choosing the right moment to lose a battle in order to win a war. The wisdom seemed hollow in the face of daily humiliation, but Kieran held onto it like a lifeline, using it to maintain the careful control that kept him from lashing out in ways that would only make his situation worse. His grandfather had lived through experiences that made high school bullying seem trivial by comparison. And if Yuki Tanaka could maintain his dignity and principles through internment camps and decades of casual racism, then surely Kieran could endure a few months of teenage cruelty. "Leave him alone, Tanner." "Days." The voice that cut through the morning air belonged to Autumn Reed, and even before turning to see her, Kieran felt something in his chest ease slightly at the sound of her intervention. She emerged from the direction of the library, her arms full of books, and her auburn hair catching the morning light like burnished copper, and fixed Tanner with a stare that could have frozen water. Autumn Reed was everything her older brother Jackson wasn't. Kind where he was cruel, intelligent where he was merely cunning, genuinely concerned about others where he was focused solely on his own interests. At 16, she already possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she stood for, regardless of what others might think about her choices. Her green eyes, flecked with gold that seemed to shift and change depending on her mood and the light, missed nothing and judged little, seeing through the superficial markers of wealth and status that dominated social interactions at Lincoln High to the character beneath. She'd been one of the few students to show Kieran genuine kindness since his arrival, helping him find classrooms during his first confusing days, offering to share her notes when he'd missed assignments due to schedule changes, and most importantly, sitting with him in the library during lunch periods when she noticed him eating alone at a corner table, his sandwich and apple spread out on napkins beside textbooks and homework assignments. Their conversations during those lunch periods had revealed a depth of intelligence and compassion that made Kieran's pulse quicken whenever he saw her approaching. She talked about her plans for environmental science in college, her frustration with the casual waste and conspicuous consumption that characterized their affluent community, her theories about human psychology and social dynamics. But more than her intelligence, it was her genuine kindness that drew him to her. The way she remembered details about their conversations, the way she asked follow-up questions that showed she was truly listening, the way she treated him like a person worth knowing rather than a charity case worth pitying. Tanner's expression shifted as he registered Autumn's intervention, his practiced smile becoming something uglier and more predatory. He turned his attention from Kieran to her with the smooth pivot of someone accustomed to adapting his tactics to whatever target presented itself. His blue eyes tracked her movement as she approached, and Kieran could see the wheels turning behind that handsome facade as Tanner calculated how to use this new element to his advantage. "Oh, I see what's happening here," Tanner said, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd just discovered a particularly interesting secret. "Little Autumn's got a thing for the charity case. That's cute, really cute, but don't you think you're setting your sights a little low?" He stepped closer to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, using his height and physical presence as weapons of intimidation. "I mean, your type usually doesn't go for guys who can't afford to take you anywhere nicer than the dollar menu at McDonald's." Kieran felt something twist and burn in his chest as he watched Autumn's cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. The flush made her freckles stand out more prominently, and he could see the way her jaw tightened as she fought to maintain her composure in the face of Tanner's deliberately provocative comments. She'd been nothing but kind to him, treating him with respect and genuine interest, and watching her become a target because of her association with him filled him with a guilt that was almost physical in its intensity. "My type," Autumn shot back, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled slightly around her books, "definitely doesn't include bullies who think their daddy's money gives them the right to treat other people like garbage." The comeback was delivered with enough fire to draw appreciative murmurs from some of the gathered students, but Kieran could hear the slight waver in her voice that spoke of nerves and the stress of being placed in such a public confrontation. She wasn't used to this kind of attention, wasn't equipped for the psychological warfare that Tanner had perfected over years of practice. Tanner's laugh was cold and completely devoid of any genuine humor, the sound of someone who found entertainment in other people's discomfort. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that carried an undercurrent of threat. "But you know what, Autumn? I'm feeling generous today. I'm going to give you a chance to make the smart choice here before you embarrass yourself any further." He looked back at Kieran with renewed interest, his gaze taking on the calculating quality of a predator who'd just realized his prey might provide even better sport than he'd initially anticipated. "You know what, Goodwill? I think your bike would look so much better with some custom modifications. A few personal touches to really make it stand out from all the other pieces of junk in the bike rack." Jackson and Braden nodded eagerly, their expressions lighting up with the anticipation of whatever cruel entertainment their leader was planning. They'd participated in enough of Tanner's pranks to recognize the particular tone he used when he was moving beyond mere verbal harassment into something more concrete and damaging. Kieran finally turned around, his dark eyes meeting Tanner's blue ones for a brief moment before looking away, a gesture that Tanner immediately interpreted as submission. "Please just leave it alone," Kieran said quietly, his voice carrying none of the defiance that Tanner was hoping to provoke. "I haven't done anything to you. Please just leave it alone," Tanner mimicked in an exaggerated, high-pitched voice that sent his followers into fresh peals of laughter and drew snickers from some of the gathered students. "What are you going to do if we don't, Goodwill? Tell on us? Run crying to the principal like a little kid?" The mockery hit its target with surgical precision, and Kieran felt his cheeks burn with the familiar heat of humiliation. But rather than rising to the bait, he simply turned and walked toward the building as the first bell rang, its electronic chime echoing across the parking lot and signaling the official start of another school day. Behind him, he could hear Tanner's voice promising Autumn that their conversation wasn't over, and the sick feeling in his stomach intensified as he realized that his presence in her life was now causing her to become a target for the same harassment he'd been enduring. The morning passed in its usual blur of classes, where Kieran worked overtime to remain invisible, sitting in carefully chosen seats that allowed him to participate when necessary without drawing undue attention to himself. His teachers, overwhelmed with large class sizes and administrative demands, were too busy to notice the subtle social dynamics that played out among their students, missing the careful way certain students avoided eye contact with others, the strategic seating arrangements that kept potential victims away from their tormentors, the low-level tension that hummed beneath the surface of seemingly normal classroom interactions. During second period English, Kieran found himself seated 2 rows behind Braden Foster, close enough to overhear the whispered conversations that were passed between Tanner's group like notes in a conspiracy. They were planning something for after school, something that involved his bike and what Braden kept referring to as artistic improvements. The fragments of conversation he caught made his stomach clench with dread, but he forced himself to focus on the lesson about literary symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird, finding bitter irony in the discussion of prejudice and social injustice, while his own situation played out in real time around him. Third period was algebra, where Kieran actually excelled despite his family's circumstances, his natural aptitude for mathematics allowing him to solve problems that left many of his wealthier classmates struggling. But even his academic success seemed to work against him, marking him as different in yet another way, drawing the kind of attention from teachers that made some students resentful. When Mrs. Henderson called on him to solve a particularly challenging equation, and he provided the correct answer with an explanation that showed deep understanding of the underlying concepts, he could feel eyes on him from around the classroom, some admiring, others calculating how this information might be used. Lunch period was usually his refuge, spent in the library with Autumn, where they could talk quietly about books and ideas and the small details of their lives that seemed important only to them. But today, the shadow of the morning's confrontation hung over their conversation like a storm cloud. Autumn apologized repeatedly for making his situation worse, her guilt evident in the way she picked at her sandwich without eating and avoided making eye contact. "It's not your fault," Kieran told her for the fourth time, though his own voice sounded strained even to his own ears. "Tanner was going to escalate things eventually anyway. At least now I know where I stand." "But it is my fault," she insisted, finally looking up at him with eyes that held tears she was fighting not to shed. "He's doing this because of me, because he thinks—" She trailed off, her cheeks reddening again in a way that made something warm bloom in Kieran's chest, despite the circumstances. "Because he thinks what?" Kieran asked, though part of him already knew the answer and felt a mixture of hope and terror at the implications. "Because he thinks I like you," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper in the hushed atmosphere of the library. "And maybe he's not wrong about that." The admission hung between them like a bridge across uncertain territory, and despite the sick anger churning in his stomach over the anticipated destruction of his bike, Kieran felt something warm and bright unfurl in his chest. He'd noticed Autumn from his very first day at Lincoln High, not just because she was beautiful, though she was, with her auburn hair and expressive green eyes, and the way she moved with unconscious grace through the hallways, but because she seemed to genuinely care about people in a way that was rare among their age group. "I like you too," he said simply, the words coming out easier than he'd expected. "I have since that first day when you helped me find the chemistry lab and didn't make me feel stupid for being lost." Her smile, when it came, was like sunshine breaking through clouds, transforming her face and making the library seem brighter despite the fluorescent lighting. But the moment of happiness was tinged with the knowledge that their mutual attraction had now painted an even larger target on both their backs. By the time the final bell rang, Kieran had almost convinced himself that maybe Tanner would get bored and move on to easier targets, that the threats had been empty, posturing designed to establish dominance rather than genuine promises of destruction. He'd heard that kind of tough talk before from bullies who were more interested in the psychological impact of their threats than in following through with actual action. He was wrong. After his last class, trigonometry with Mr. Peterson, Kieran made his way toward the bike racks with the careful optimism of someone hoping against hope that disaster might have been averted. He'd planned his route home to avoid Tanner's usual hangouts, the parking lot where the wealthy kids gathered around their expensive cars, the strip mall where they went for coffee and gossip, the park where they sometimes congregated to engage in the kind of recreational activities that their parents preferred not to know about. But as he rounded the corner of the gymnasium, his footsteps slowed and then stopped completely as he took in the scene before him. His bike lay on its side like a fallen soldier, barely recognizable beneath the systematic destruction that had been visited upon it. The tires had been slashed with what looked like a knife or box cutter, the rubber hanging in ragged strips that spoke of methodical rather than random vandalism. The chain had been cut with bolt cutters, the severed links scattered around the bike like metallic confetti. Spray paint covered the frame in crude words and drawings that were designed to be as offensive and humiliating as possible. Profanity mixed with sexual imagery and personal attacks that revealed an intimate knowledge of Kieran's circumstances and insecurities. The seat had been removed entirely and was nowhere to be seen, probably thrown into a dumpster or hidden somewhere it would never be found. The handlebars had been twisted into an unnatural position that would have required significant force to achieve. What looked like an entire bottle of ketchup and mustard from the cafeteria had been squirted over everything, creating a sticky, disgusting mess that attracted flies and made the whole scene look like the aftermath of some bizarre food fight. But it was the personal touches that hit hardest. The words "charity case" and "goodwill special" prominently displayed in bright red paint, the crude drawings that mocked not just Kieran, but his family's circumstances, the way every element of the destruction seemed designed to maximize not just the physical damage, but the psychological impact. "Oh no, oh Kieran, I'm so sorry." Autumn's voice came from behind him, soft with sympathy and raw with outrage that someone could be so deliberately cruel. "This is all my fault, all of it." He turned to find her standing there with tears streaming down her cheeks, her books clutched against her chest like a shield that couldn't protect her from the guilt she felt at seeing the destruction that had been wrought in her name. For a moment, his carefully maintained emotional control threatened to crack, as he saw his own pain reflected in her eyes, magnified by her sense of responsibility for something that was entirely beyond her control. "It's not your fault," he managed to say, though his voice sounded strained and foreign to his own ears. "This is just who they are. This is what they do." "Of course it is my fault," she said, stepping closer to examine the damage in detail, her expression growing angrier with each new element of destruction she discovered. "Tanner did this because I stood up for you, because he thinks I care about you, and he can't stand the idea that I might choose someone he considers beneath his notice." She looked up at him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears and fierce determination. "Because he thinks I like you. And maybe he's not wrong about that." The repetition of her earlier admission, delivered with even more conviction despite the circumstances, sent another warm rush through Kieran's chest. The destruction of his bike was devastating. It represented not just transportation, but independence, connection to his grandfather, one of the few possessions that linked him to his life in Portland. But standing here with Autumn, seeing the genuine care and anger in her eyes, he found that the loss felt somehow manageable. "I like you too," he said again, his voice stronger this time. "More than like you, actually." Despite everything, the ruined bike, the gathering crowd of students who had come to gawk at the destruction, the knowledge that this was just the beginning of whatever campaign Tanner had planned, Autumn smiled. It was a small smile, tempered by the circumstances, but real and warm and directed entirely at him. As they stood together surveying the wreckage, Kieran found his mind turning to his grandfather and the lessons that had shaped his understanding of conflict, violence, and the careful balance between endurance and action. Grandpa Yuki had been born in California in 1924, the son of immigrants who had built a life through hard work and careful savings, only to see everything destroyed when Executive Order 9066 forced them into internment camps during World War II. Yuki had been 17 when his family was forced to sell their small farm for a fraction of its value, and board trains that carried them to Manzanar, one of 10 camps where American citizens of Japanese descent were imprisoned for the crime of sharing ancestry with the enemy. He'd spent 3 years behind barbed wire, his education interrupted, his family's savings depleted, his faith in American justice severely tested. But rather than letting the experience embitter him, Yuki had emerged from the camps with a deeper understanding of human nature and a philosophy that emphasized dignity, self-control, and the strategic application of strength. He'd started learning judo in the 1950s, drawn to the art's emphasis on using an opponent's force against them, on achieving victory through technique and timing rather than brute strength. By the time he'd married Kieran's grandmother and opened his small dojo in Portland, Yuki had earned his black belt and developed a teaching philosophy that went far beyond the physical techniques of throwing and grappling. He taught his students, and later his grandson, that judo was a way of life that emphasized mutual welfare, benefit, and understanding. But he also taught that there came times when peaceful resolution was impossible, when the only way to stop greater harm was to act decisively and with purpose. "There will be times when people will test you," his grandfather had told Kieran during their last training session before the families moved to California. They'd been practicing randori, the free-form sparring that allowed students to apply techniques in a more dynamic environment, and Kieran had just successfully executed a throw against a partner who outweighed him by 30 pounds. They will push and push, hoping to make you lose control, hoping to provoke you into doing something foolish that will justify whatever cruelty they've already planned. Grandpa Yuki had paused in his instruction, his weathered hands adjusting Kieran's GI with the automatic precision of someone who had performed the same action thousands of times. But remember, Kieran, the goal of judo is not to hurt your opponent. It is to neutralize the threat while maintaining your own balance and dignity. Sometimes that means enduring, sometimes it means walking away, but sometimes... He'd looked directly into Kieran's eyes with an intensity that made the young man understand that this was one of the most important lessons he would ever receive. Sometimes it means showing them that their perception of your weakness was a dangerous mistake. Kieran had been practicing judo since the age of 7, training almost daily with his grandfather in the small dojo that occupied the converted garage behind the Tanaka family home. His small frame, which made him a target for bullies who equated size with strength, was actually an advantage in judo, where technique and timing mattered more than raw power. Beneath his quiet exterior was a foundation of controlled strength and technical skill that could only come from years of dedicated practice under the guidance of a master who demanded excellence in both technique and character. But his grandfather had also taught him that true mastery meant using those skills only when absolutely necessary, that the strongest warrior was the one who could win without fighting. It was a lesson that had served him well over the years, allowing him to avoid conflicts that might have escalated into something more serious, helping him develop the self-control and patience that marked him as different from his peers. Now, standing in the wreckage of his destroyed bicycle, Kieran found himself wondering if there was a line somewhere, a point beyond which endurance became enablement, where choosing not to fight became an invitation for greater cruelty. The walk home with Autumn became the brightest part of what had otherwise been a devastating day. She insisted on walking with him, claiming that she needed the exercise and that her car was having problems anyway, transparent excuses that nonetheless allowed them to spend time together without making Kieran feel like a charity case who needed rescuing. As they made their way through the tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, Autumn told him about her plans for environmental science in college. Her dream of working for the National Park Service, or maybe joining one of the research teams that studied climate change and conservation. She talked about her frustration with her brother's choice of friends, her theory that Tanner's behavior stemmed from deep insecurities about living up to his father's expectations, and her belief that most bullies were really just scared kids who had learned to mask their fear with aggression. "You're not like most people," she said, as they reached the modest apartment complex where Kieran lived with his mother. The building was clean and well-maintained, but obviously designed for working families rather than the wealthy executives and professionals who dominated the more affluent areas of town. Most guys would have gotten angry by now, would have tried to fight back, or at least threatened to get revenge. "Would that make you think better of me?" Kieran asked, genuinely curious about her answer. They'd stopped walking and were standing beside the small garden that his mother had started in the tiny patch of earth outside their ground-floor apartment, where tomatoes and herbs grew in careful rows that spoke of someone who understood the value of growing their own food. Autumn considered the question seriously, her head tilted slightly as she thought about her response. "No," she said finally. "I don't think it would. But I also think there has to be a line somewhere, you know. Something that makes you say, enough is enough, and decide to take a stand." The conversation stayed with Kieran through the evening as he helped his mother prepare dinner in their small kitchen. The destruction of his bike, a shadow that neither of them acknowledged directly, but that influenced every interaction. Sarah Blackwood was a woman who had learned to read her son's moods with the precision that came from years of single-handedly navigating the challenges of raising a thoughtful, sensitive child in a world that often rewarded neither thoughtfulness nor sensitivity. She'd noticed his late arrival, had seen the way he moved with the careful control of someone holding back strong emotions, had registered the absence of the bike that should have been locked to the railing outside their apartment. But she also knew her son well enough to understand that pushing for information before he was ready to share it would only cause him to retreat further into himself. Instead, she prepared his favorite meal, homemade macaroni and cheese with breadcrumbs on top, green beans from their small garden, and the chocolate chip cookies she'd learned to make from a recipe that had been passed down through 3 generations of her family. They ate together at the small table by the window, talking about her day at the insurance office where she processed claims and dealt with people who were often experiencing the worst moments of their lives, and his classes, and the small details of their daily existence that took on greater importance when they were all you had to hold on to. It was only after dinner, when they were washing dishes together in the companionable silence that had always marked their best moments, that she finally broached the subject that hung between them like a storm cloud. "Your bike?" she asked quietly, not looking at him directly, but focusing on the plate she was drying with methodical precision. "Vandalized," he replied, matching her tone and continuing to scrub the pot they'd used for the macaroni. "Pretty thoroughly." She nodded slowly, processing the information and all its implications. "The same kids who've been giving you trouble?" "Yeah." Another long pause, during which Sarah Blackwood weighed her options and considered her son's needs against the family's precarious situation. They couldn't afford to replace the bike, not immediately, and they certainly couldn't afford for Kieran to get into the kind of trouble that might result from confronting his tormentors directly. But she also couldn't stand the thought of her kind, intelligent son being driven to the breaking point by kids who had never faced real consequences for their actions. "We'll figure something out," she said finally, reaching over to squeeze his shoulder in a gesture that conveyed more love and support than 1,000 words could have managed. "We always do." That night, Kieran lay in his narrow bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about lines that shouldn't be crossed, about his grandfather's teachings regarding endurance and action, about Autumn's words concerning the point where enough becomes enough. The apartment was quiet around him, filled with the small sounds of settling wood and distant traffic that formed the soundtrack of their new life in California. He thought about his destroyed bike and what it had represented, not just transportation, but independence and connection to his past. He thought about the deliberate cruelty that had gone into its destruction, the personal nature of the attacks that revealed how closely his tormentors had been studying him, looking for weaknesses to exploit and insecurities to magnify. But mostly, he thought about Autumn standing next to her car with tears in her eyes, and the knowledge that his presence in her life was now causing her to become a target for the same harassment he'd been enduring. The next morning brought new humiliation in the form of public transportation. Kieran had to take the bus to school, immediately marking him as different from the students who drove their own cars or got rides from parents in luxury vehicles. The school bus, with its distinctive yellow paint and institutional seating, was primarily used by students from the less affluent areas of the district, and riding it was like wearing a sign that announced your family's economic circumstances to anyone who cared to notice. Tanner Mills was waiting at the bus stop, having clearly planned this encounter with the same tactical precision he brought to all his campaigns of harassment. He stood with Jackson and Braden beside a sleek BMW convertible that belonged to one of their friends, all three of them looking like they'd stepped out of a catalog for expensive casual wear. "Look who's riding the loser cruiser now," Tanner announced loudly as the bus approached with its distinctive rumble and squeal of brakes. "What's wrong, Goodwill? Your sweet ride not working out for you anymore?" The students waiting for the bus, most of them younger kids who lived in the same apartment complex as Kieran, along with a few older students whose families were struggling with the same economic realities that defined his own family's circumstances, looked uncomfortable as Tanner's voice carried clearly across the morning air. Some of them recognized him from school and understood that witnessing this confrontation made them potential targets for future harassment. Kieran felt his cheeks burn with the familiar heat of humiliation as he took a seat toward the front of the bus, choosing a spot where he could see potential trouble coming and where the bus driver might intervene if things escalated beyond verbal harassment. But Tanner wasn't finished with his entertainment. To Kieran's surprise and growing dread, Tanner climbed onto the bus behind him, apparently willing to delay his own more comfortable transportation in order to maximize Kieran's discomfort. He slid into the seat directly behind Kieran, with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told that his presence was unwelcome anywhere. "You know what I heard?" Tanner said conversationally, his voice pitched loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear every word. "I heard that little Autumn Reed thinks she's your girlfriend now. That's pretty funny, considering she could do so much better if she just opened her eyes and noticed the guys who could actually afford to take her places." The words hit their target with surgical precision, and Kieran felt his hands clench involuntarily as he stared straight ahead through the front windshield of the bus. Around them, other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking sympathetic but unwilling to intervene, others showing the kind of uncomfortable amusement that came from watching someone else's misfortune. "I mean, what's she going to do for fun?" Tanner continued, warming to his theme. "Go window shopping at thrift stores. Split a value meal at McDonald's. Maybe you can take her on a romantic bike ride. Oh wait, that's right, you don't have a bike anymore." The laughter that followed was cruel and pointed, and Kieran felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach as he realized that Tanner's harassment was escalating beyond simple bullying into something more systematic and personal. This wasn't just about establishing dominance anymore. It was about destroying his life piece by piece, starting with his possessions and moving on to his relationships and his sense of self-worth. The harassment continued throughout the day with increasing boldness and creativity. During passing periods, Jackson accidentally shoulder-checked Kieran into lockers, with enough force to send his books scattering across the hallway floor. then offered mock apologies that were clearly designed to draw maximum attention to the incident. The collision was hard enough to leave bruises on Kieran's shoulder and ribs, but not quite forceful enough to be considered assault by any administrator who might witness it. During lunch, Braden knocked over Kieran's water bottle, soaking the homework he'd spread out on the library table in an attempt to find a quiet place to work. The water spread across carefully written notes and completed assignments, rendering hours of work illegible and forcing Kieran to start over on projects that were due the following day. When he looked up at Braden, the taller boy just shrugged and offered an apology that was so transparently insincere it was almost insulting. "Sorry, man," Braden said with a grin that revealed his enjoyment of the situation. "I'm just really clumsy sometimes. You should probably be more careful about where you put your stuff." But the cruelest moment came later in the afternoon, in the library where Kieran had hoped to find some measure of peace and where Autumn was working on a research project for her environmental science class. She was surrounded by books and articles about renewable energy, her notes spread out in the organized chaos that characterized her approach to academic work. When she saw Kieran with his water-damaged homework, her face filled with concern and barely controlled anger. "What happened?" she asked, immediately making space for him at her table and offering tissues to help dry off the papers. Before Kieran could answer her questions, Tanner appeared as if summoned by some cruel magic, sliding into the seat next to Autumn with the kind of confidence that suggested he belonged wherever he chose to place himself. His presence immediately changed the dynamic of the space, turning what had been a peaceful refuge into a stage for whatever performance he'd planned. "Hey, beautiful," he said, completely ignoring Kieran as if he were invisible. "I was thinking you might want to go to homecoming with someone who can actually afford to rent a tux that doesn't smell like mothballs. Maybe someone who can take you to dinner somewhere that doesn't have a $1 menu." The invitation was delivered with Tanner's most charming smile, the one that had convinced teachers to give him extensions on assignments and parents to overlook his more questionable behavior. But Autumn saw right through the superficial charm to the calculated cruelty beneath. "I wouldn't go anywhere with you, Tanner," she replied, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her papers closer to herself. "Not to homecoming, not to the corner store, not even if you were the last person on Earth and the survival of humanity depended on it." Tanner's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the charming smile fading to reveal something uglier and more dangerous underneath. He leaned closer to her, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly designed to intimidate through the implied threat of physical dominance. "Come on, Autumn," he said, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. "You're too smart to waste your time with charity case here. Everyone knows it. I'm offering you a chance to upgrade to someone who can actually provide for you, someone who won't embarrass you in front of your friends." "The only person embarrassing me right now is you," Autumn shot back, her green eyes flashing with anger that made them seem to glow in the fluorescent lighting of the library. "I don't care how much money your family has, or what kind of car you drive, or whether you can afford expensive restaurants. I care about character, and you've shown me exactly what yours looks like." Tanner's face darkened with genuine anger as his easy charm was rebuffed so publicly and definitively. "You know what? Fine," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that carried clear menace. "But don't come crying to me when your little boyfriend disappoints you. Which he will, because that's what losers do. They disappoint the people stupid enough to care about them." The words were designed to hurt both of them, and Kieran felt their impact like physical blows. But it was the look in Autumn's eyes, hurt, angry, but also determined, that finally showed him where his line was drawn. He could endure harassment directed at himself, could absorb cruelty and humiliation as long as it stayed focused on him. But watching someone he cared about become a target because of her association with him, seeing her dragged into a conflict she'd done nothing to create, that was beyond what he could tolerate. That afternoon, Kieran found himself walking home alone again, having deliberately missed the bus to avoid another session of public humiliation. The October air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter, and the walk gave him too much time to think about everything that had happened and everything that was likely to happen if the current trajectory continued. He was still lost in thought when he reached the school parking lot and saw a scene that made his blood freeze in his veins. Autumn was standing next to her car, tears streaming down her face, while Tanner, Jackson, and Braden surrounded her in a formation that was clearly designed to prevent her from escaping. From their body language and the way Autumn was pressed back against her car, this wasn't a friendly conversation. Other students walked past the confrontation, but none seemed inclined to get involved. Some glanced over with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable sympathy to cruel amusement, but all of them continued on their way without stopping to offer assistance or intervention. The unspoken rule of high school social dynamics was clear. Getting involved in someone else's conflict was a good way to become a target yourself. "I told you this morning that you'd come around eventually," Tanner was saying as Kieran approached close enough to hear the conversation. His voice carried the tone of someone who was used to getting his way through persistence and intimidation. "All I'm asking for is one date. Just give me a chance to show you what you're missing out on." "I said no," Autumn replied, her voice shaking with emotion but still firm in its rejection. "I don't want to go out with you, and I don't appreciate you cornering me like this. This is harassment, and if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to report you to the administration." Harassment? Tanner's voice rose slightly, and for the first time, Kieran could see genuine anger replace the calculated cruelty that usually characterized his interactions. "I'm trying to do you a favor here, Autumn. You think hanging around with that loser is doing your reputation any good? You think people don't notice when you choose to associate with charity cases instead of people who actually matter?" Kieran felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach as he realized what was happening. Autumn was trapped between Tanner and her car, with Jackson and Braden positioned to block any escape routes she might try to use. The positioning was deliberate and practiced, suggesting that this wasn't the first time they'd used these tactics to intimidate someone into compliance. She said no. Kieran's voice cut through the afternoon air, quieter than Tanner's, but carrying clearly across the parking lot. "You should listen to her." All four participants in the confrontation turned to look at him, and for a moment that seemed to stretch forever, nobody moved. Then Tanner's face broke into a grin that was all teeth and no warmth, the expression of a predator who had just realized that his prey had voluntarily walked into the trap. "Well, look who finally grew a backbone," he said, taking a step toward Kieran while his friends shifted position to flank him. "What are you going to do about it, Goodwill? Fight me? You?" The question hung in the air, loaded with challenge and mockery, and Kieran was acutely aware of the other students who had stopped to watch, sensing the brewing confrontation with the instinctive awareness that teenagers possessed for social drama. Some held phones, ready to record whatever was about to unfold for later sharing on social media. Others looked nervous, but excited, anticipating the kind of violence that would give them something to talk about for weeks. Kieran could feel the weight of every decision that had led to this moment, every time he'd chosen to endure rather than resist, every humiliation he'd absorbed in the hope that things might get better on their own, every moment when he'd chosen his grandfather's teachings about patience and self-control over the more immediate satisfaction of fighting back. But he could also see Autumn's frightened expression, the way she'd pressed herself back against her car as if trying to disappear, the tears that continued to stream down her cheeks as she found herself caught in the middle of a conflict she'd done nothing to create. The sight of her fear and the knowledge that her only crime had been showing him kindness finally showed him exactly where his line was drawn. "I'm asking you nicely to leave her alone," Kieran said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline that was beginning to course through his system. "Please." Tanner laughed again, and this time Jackson and Braden joined in with the eager enthusiasm of followers who recognized their cue. "Please? Oh, that's rich. You're actually begging me now. This is even better than I hoped." He took another step closer, close enough that Kieran could smell his expensive cologne and see the cruel amusement dancing in his blue eyes. "Here's what's going to happen, Goodwill. You're going to turn around and walk away like the coward you are, and I'm going to continue my conversation with Autumn here. Maybe she'll be more reasonable once she doesn't have to worry about protecting your feelings." "Tanner, stop it," Autumn said, her voice gaining strength as her fear transformed into anger. "This is insane. I don't like you, I'm not going to like you, and harassing me isn't going to change that. You can't force someone to care about you." "Harassing?" Tanner's voice rose again, and this time Kieran could see genuine fury replace the calculated cruelty that had defined his behavior. "I'm trying to do you a favor here, Autumn. You think hanging around with this pathetic loser is doing you any good? Look at him." He gestured dismissively at Kieran, his contempt visible in every line of his body. "Look at his clothes, his attitude, the way he just takes whatever anyone dishes out to him. Is that really the kind of guy you want to be associated with? Someone who can't even stand up for himself, let alone protect you?" Kieran felt the familiar humiliation rise in his chest, but this time it was mixed with something else, a cold, focused anger that his grandfather had taught him to recognize and control. The feeling meant he was approaching the edge of his self-control, the point where reaction might override judgment and training might overcome philosophy. "You know what I think?" Tanner continued, apparently interpreting Kieran's silence as surrender and pressing his advantage. "I think you need a reminder of where you stand around here. I think you need to understand exactly what happens to people who don't know their place." He reached out and shoved Kieran backward, not hard enough to knock him down, but forceful enough to make him stumble several steps. It was the same casual disrespect he'd been showing for weeks, but this time it felt different. This time there was an audience that included Autumn, and this time Kieran had finally found the line he wouldn't allow anyone to cross. "Don't," Kieran said quietly, straightening up and looking directly into Tanner's eyes for the first time since the confrontation had begun. Something in his voice or posture must have registered, because Tanner's expression shifted slightly, uncertainty flickering across his features for just a moment before his ego reasserted itself. He was too invested in the performance now, too committed to the image he'd cultivated among his peers, to back down in the face of what he still perceived as weakness. "Or what?" he demanded, shoving Kieran again, harder this time. "What are you going to do about it, Charity Case?" The world seemed to slow down as Kieran processed what was happening, his grandfather's training taking over as his conscious mind stepped back and allowed years of practiced response to guide his actions. He could see the crowd of students that had gathered in a rough circle around them, some holding phones to record whatever was about to unfold. He could see Autumn's frightened expression, the way she'd pressed herself back against her car. He could see Jackson and Braden positioning themselves to jump in if needed, confident that their leader could handle one small, quiet kid who had never shown any inclination toward violence. What they couldn't see was the years of training that had shaped Kieran's understanding of balance, leverage, and timing. They couldn't see the countless hours he'd spent learning to read an opponent's movements, to find the exact moment when aggression became vulnerability, when forward momentum became an invitation for a throw. They couldn't see his grandfather's patient instruction in principles that turned size and strength into disadvantages when used carelessly against someone who understood how to redirect force rather than meet it head-on. Tanner shoved him a third time, putting more force behind it in an attempt to provoke the kind of reaction that would justify whatever escalation he'd planned. And in that moment, as Tanner's hands made contact with his chest and his weight shifted forward in an uncontrolled expression of aggression, Kieran finally moved. The technique was called seoi nage, a shoulder throw that used an opponent's forward momentum against them, turning their attack into the very thing that defeated them. As Tanner's hands pushed against his chest, Kieran stepped into the movement rather than away from it, turning his body 90 degrees and dropping his center of gravity while his right arm came up under Tanner's extended arm. For a split second that seemed to last forever, Tanner found himself balanced perfectly on Kieran's back, his weight distributed in a way that made him completely helpless, his feet off the ground and his fate entirely in his opponent's hands. The look of surprise and confusion on his face would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so serious. Then Kieran straightened his legs and pulled down with his left hand, and Tanner found himself flying through the air in a perfect arc, before landing hard on the asphalt parking lot with a sound that made several witnesses wince in sympathetic pain. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. Tanner lay on his back, staring up at the cloudless October sky with complete bewilderment, as if his brain couldn't process what had just happened to him. The gathered students seemed equally stunned, their phones still recording but their faces slack with shock at witnessing something that completely defied their expectations and understanding of how these confrontations were supposed to unfold. Kieran stood over his fallen tormentor, his breathing steady and his posture relaxed, despite what had just occurred. There was no triumph in his expression, no gloating or show of dominance, just the calm confidence of someone who had done exactly what was necessary and nothing more. "I asked you nicely to leave her alone," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence that had fallen over the parking lot. "I'm not asking anymore." Jackson was the first to recover from his shock, charging forward with a wild swing that telegraphed his intentions from halfway across the parking lot. His approach was all aggression and no technique, the kind of attack that relied on intimidation and the hope that his target would be too scared or inexperienced to respond effectively. Kieran sidestepped the punch with minimal effort, catching Jackson's extended arm and using the boy's own momentum to guide him into a simple hip toss that sent him tumbling across the ground to land in an undignified heap next to his leader. The throw was executed with the same calm precision as the first. No wasted motion or unnecessary force, just enough to neutralize the threat and demonstrate that resistance was futile. Braden hesitated at the edge of the circle, looking between his fallen friends and Kieran's unnaturally calm expression. The calculation was clearly visible on his face as he tried to process what he'd just witnessed and determine whether his own intervention was likely to be any more successful than his friend's attempts. "I don't want to fight you," Kieran told him honestly, his voice carrying no threat but also no uncertainty. "But I won't let you hurt her, and I won't let any of you hurt me anymore either." The statement hung in the air like a line drawn in the sand, a clear boundary that defined the new reality of their relationship. Braden looked at his friends, Tanner struggling to sit up with his perfect hair disheveled and his expensive shirt torn from impact with the ground, Jackson holding his shoulder and looking dazed, and apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Tanner was finally managing to get himself upright, his movements unsteady and his expressions cycling through confusion, embarrassment and dawning rage. How did you?" he stammered, still trying to process what had happened to him. "I've been training in judo since I was 7 years old," Kieran explained matter-of-factly, his tone conversational despite the circumstances. "My grandfather taught me that the art isn't about hurting people. It's about neutralizing threats while maintaining your own balance and dignity. He extended his hand to help Tanner up, an offer that was met with a suspicious stare filled with wounded pride and barely controlled fury. "I don't want to be your enemy," Kieran continued, his voice sincere despite everything that had happened. "I just want you to leave us alone." Tanner knocked his hand away and struggled to his feet unassisted, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage that his carefully cultivated image had been shattered so publicly and completely. "This isn't over," he snarled, but the threat lacked the conviction it might have carried earlier, undermined by the absolute ease with which Kieran had handled both him and Jackson. "Yes, it is," Kieran replied calmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that hadn't been there before. "Because if you come after me again, or if you bother Autumn again, I'll defend myself, and next time I might not be so gentle about it." The word gentle hung in the air like a challenge, and the implication that Kieran had been holding back, that what they'd just witnessed represented restraint rather than his full capability, was unmistakable. Both Tanner and Jackson had been thrown to the ground with what looked like minimal effort, their defeat so complete and effortless that it suggested reserves of skill and strength that hadn't even been tapped. As the three former bullies limped away toward Tanner's BMW, the crowd of students began to disperse, many of them casting new and curious glances at Kieran as they went. The shift in their perceptions was almost tangible. The quiet, easily overlooked new kid had just demonstrated that there was much more to him than met the eye, that assumptions based on appearance and economic circumstances could be dangerously misleading. Autumn approached him slowly, her expression mixing admiration with concern, relief with lingering fear. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft with emotion. "I'm fine," he assured her, surprised to realize that it was true. The anxiety and helplessness that had been his constant companions for weeks had evaporated, replaced by a sense of calm confidence that felt both foreign and completely natural. "Are you okay? They didn't hurt you, did they?" "No, they didn't hurt me," she said, shaking her head while tears of relief began to replace the tears of fear that had been streaming down her cheeks. "But Kieran, that was incredible. Where did you learn to do that?" "My grandfather," Kieran explained as they walked toward her car, the parking lot gradually returning to normal, as the excitement of the confrontation faded into memory and social media posts. "He always told me that the best fight is the one you don't have to finish, but sometimes you have to start it to prevent something worse from happening." As they stood together beside her car, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, Kieran felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of himself and his place in the world. For weeks, he'd been operating under the assumption that endurance was his only option, that his choices were limited to absorbing whatever cruelty others chose to inflict or escalating conflicts in ways that would ultimately make things worse. But his grandfather's teachings hadn't been about passive acceptance of injustice. They'd been about choosing the right moment to act, about understanding when patience became enablement and when action became necessary. The confrontation had lasted less than a minute, but its effects were already rippling outward through his life in ways both large and small. "Thank you," Autumn said quietly, reaching out to take his hand in a gesture that felt both natural and momentous. "For standing up for me, for standing up for yourself. I know that couldn't have been easy." "It was easier than I thought it would be," Kieran admitted, surprised by the truth of the statement. "Once I found my line, once I knew what I wouldn't let them cross, everything else was just technique." The next morning brought dramatic changes to the social ecosystem of Lincoln High School that were both subtle and profound. Word of the parking lot confrontation had spread overnight through social media and text messages, growing in the telling until Kieran had supposedly taken on half the football team and emerged victorious. The reality was more modest, but no less significant. Tanner Mills, the school's most feared bully, had been humbled in front of a crowd by someone he'd dismissed as beneath his notice. Students who had never spoken to Kieran before approached him in hallways throughout the day, some seeking friendship and others simply wanting to be associated with someone who had achieved what many had considered impossible. Teachers who had barely acknowledged his existence suddenly knew his name and made efforts to include him in class discussions, perhaps sensing that there was more to the quiet transfer student than they'd initially assumed. The change was most noticeable in Tanner himself. Gone was the swagger and casual cruelty that had defined his interactions with other students for as long as anyone could remember. He still traveled with Jackson and Braden, but the dynamic between them had shifted noticeably. The unquestioned leadership that had once characterized their relationship replaced by uncertainty and second-guessing. Where once Tanner had moved through the halls of Lincoln High like he owned them, now there was hesitation in his movements, a careful awareness of his surroundings that spoke of someone who was no longer confident in his ability to control every situation through intimidation and social pressure. The casual cruelty that had once seemed like a natural extension of his personality was replaced by a watchful wariness, as if he were constantly calculating the potential consequences of his actions. 3 days after the incident, Kieran was walking to his locker between classes when he found Tanner waiting for him in the hallway. For a moment, both boys stood there in silence, and Kieran found himself automatically assessing potential threats and escape routes before consciously relaxing his stance and reminding himself that he was no longer the helpless target he'd been just a few days earlier. "I wanted to," Tanner began, then stopped and looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard by other students or teachers. The hallway was relatively quiet, most students having already headed to their next classes, but Tanner's discomfort was evident in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot and avoided making direct eye contact. "Look, what you did the other day," he continued after a long pause, his voice lacking the confident authority that had once characterized every word he spoke. "I deserved it. All of it." The admission seemed to cost him something significant, and Kieran could see the internal struggle playing out across his features, the conflict between his ingrained sense of superiority and the dawning realization that his behavior had consequences he'd never been forced to consider before. "I've been thinking about what you said," Tanner went on, the words coming out slowly as if he were still working through the concepts as he spoke them, about balance and dignity and all that. Maybe I've been doing things wrong for a long time." "Maybe we all have," Kieran replied carefully, recognizing that this conversation represented something potentially important, not just for their relationship, but for Tanner's understanding of himself and his place in the world. "It's not too late to change direction." Tanner nodded slowly, as if the concept of fundamental change was something he was still trying to fully grasp. "Autumn really cares about you, you know," he said after another pause. "She always has, even before you stood up to me. She sees something in you that most people miss." "I care about her too," Kieran said simply, the truth of the statement evident in his voice and expression. "Yeah, I can see that now," Tanner replied, finally meeting Kieran's eyes directly for the first time since their confrontation. "Look, I know this doesn't make up for everything, but I'm sorry. For the bike, for the harassment, for the way I treated both of you. It wasn't right, and I should have been better than that." The apology was awkward and clearly difficult for him to deliver, but it seemed genuine in a way that surprised Kieran. He studied his former tormentor's face and saw something there that hadn't been visible before: vulnerability, uncertainty, and perhaps the beginning of actual self-reflection and personal growth. "Thank you," Kieran said, meaning it. "That does mean something." They parted ways without shaking hands or making grand declarations of friendship, but something fundamental had shifted between them, It wasn't forgiveness exactly. That would take time and consistent behavior to earn, but it was acknowledgement of past wrongs and perhaps the foundation for something better in the future. That afternoon, Kieran found Autumn waiting by the bike racks with a surprise that took his breath away. Beside her stood a gleaming mountain bike that looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor, its paint pristine and its components clearly professional-grade equipment. "Before you say anything," she said quickly, seeing his expression and recognizing the argument that was forming in his mind, "it's not charity, and I'm not trying to rescue you or make you feel like you owe me anything." She gestured toward the bicycle with obvious pride in her planning and preparation. "My dad owns a bike shop downtown, and this was a return from a customer who decided they wanted a different color after they'd already taken it home. We couldn't resell it as new because of store policy, even though there's literally nothing wrong with it except for a tiny scratch on the frame that you can barely see." Kieran walked around the bike slowly, taking in its quality components and professional assembly. The craftsmanship was evident in every detail, from the precision of the cable routing to the perfect alignment of the wheels. It was easily 3 times nicer than his original bike had been, representing the kind of equipment that serious cyclists used for recreational riding and competitive racing. "I can't accept this," he said, though his voice lacked conviction as he imagined himself riding something so beautiful and well-made. "Yes, you can," Autumn replied firmly, her green eyes sparkling with determination and barely suppressed excitement. "Because I'm not giving it to you outright. I'm loaning it to you until you can afford to buy it from me at cost. Consider this a long-term payment plan with very reasonable terms and an understanding creditor." She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell her shampoo and see the individual flecks of gold that danced in her green eyes when the light hit them just right. "Besides, I have ulterior motives for wanting you to have reliable transportation. I was hoping my boyfriend might want to go on some bike rides with me, maybe explore some of the trails up in the hills." The word boyfriend sent a warm rush of happiness through his chest, and Kieran found himself smiling with genuine joy for what felt like the first time in weeks. "I think that could definitely be arranged," he said, reaching out to take her hand in his. As they rode home together that evening, taking the long route through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood and talking about everything and nothing, Kieran reflected on all the changes that had rippled outward from that single moment of decision in the parking lot. The confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds, but its effects were still spreading through his life in ways both large and small. He thought about his grandfather's teachings and realized that he'd learned something new and important about the concept of balance. It wasn't just about maintaining your center of gravity during a physical technique. It was about finding the equilibrium between standing up for yourself and becoming the very thing you opposed, between enduring injustice and perpetuating cycles of violence, between showing mercy and demonstrating strength. Most importantly, he'd learned that respect wasn't something that could be demanded or taken by force. It had to be earned through actions that demonstrated character, and once earned, it carried responsibilities that were just as important as the benefits it provided. The halls of Lincoln High School would never be completely free of conflict or cruelty. That was simply the nature of bringing together hundreds of adolescents, each dealing with their own insecurities, ambitions, and family pressures. But the balance of power had shifted in subtle ways that made life better for those who had previously felt helpless against the predators in their midst. Other students who had been targets of bullying found their courage inspired by Kieran's example, standing up for themselves in small ways that gradually eroded the culture of intimidation that had dominated the school's social dynamics. Teachers began paying closer attention to the interactions between students, recognizing that academic achievement was impossible in an environment where some students lived in fear of their peers, and sometimes Kieran thought, as he watched Autumn laugh at something he'd said while they pedaled through the golden afternoon light. The most important victories were the ones that prevented others from having to fight the same battles you'd faced. His stand against Tanner hadn't just changed his own life. It had demonstrated to every other potential victim that bullies were not invincible, that there were lines that shouldn't be crossed, and that sometimes the quiet kid in the corner might be carrying the tools to change everything. As the autumn sun set behind them, casting long shadows across the peaceful suburban streets they rode through, Kieran Blackwood pedaled toward home with the knowledge that he'd finally found his place in this new town. It wasn't the place he'd expected when he'd first arrived 3 weeks ago, nervous and uncertain about what the future might hold. But it was a place that fit him perfectly. Protector, friend, and living proof that strength comes in many different forms, not all of them immediately visible to those who mistake quietness for weakness or mistake gentleness for an inability to act when action becomes necessary. The gentle clicking of their bike chains and the soft whisper of tires on asphalt provided a peaceful soundtrack to their conversation as they rode through neighborhoods where families were gathering for dinner, and the warm glow of lights in windows spoke of homes where people felt safe and cared for. It was the kind of evening that made all the struggles seem worthwhile. The kind of moment that reminded you why it was important to stand up for the things and people that mattered most. In the distance, the mountains that surrounded their valley were painted in shades of purple and gold by the setting sun, and Kieran thought about all the trails that wound through those hills, all the adventures that awaited them, all the conversations and discoveries and quiet moments that would define their relationship in the months and years to come. But mostly, he thought about how good it felt to ride beside someone who saw him clearly, not as a charity case or a victim or a threat, but as exactly who he was. A young man who had learned that true strength sometimes meant enduring, sometimes meant walking away, and sometimes meant standing your ground, no matter what the cost might be.